John's Gospel is a carefully selected collection of acts and teachings of Jesus to show that Jesus is God's agent and Son. And he shows that the joint mission of Father, Son and Holy Spirit is to pardon and give new life to those who were formerly rebels. And it's a costly mission that reaches its glorious victory through the humiliation, suffering and death of the Son. It is also a mission that fulfills all the promises and expectations of the Old Testament scriptures. And to help us see that, John gives us the setting of many of Jesus' signs. And these settings are often the major feasts in the Jewish calendar. And Jesus shows that he is the ultimate focus of these festivals. Now today we catch up with Jesus in Jerusalem at the week-long Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. It was also called the Feast of Ingathering, instituted during the journey from slavery in Egypt to the Promised Land. And in that wilderness, this festival looked forward to the promise that there would be an ingathering of grapes and olives in that Promised Land. And afterwards, it was also a remembrance of how God had provided for them in the wilderness. And for that reason, the people for 1 week would live again in makeshift tents, booths or tabernacles. And there they would remember how God had provided for and led their forebears, how he provided water from the rock and was a pillar of light to guide them in the darkness. Now in John's Gospel, it is sometimes good to stand back and see the shape of the whole book. And something like the Bible Project can help. And here's its take on today's passage.
After this, John has designed another collection of stories that took place during 4 Jewish sacred days or feasts. And again, Jesus uses the images related to the feasts to make claims about himself. So Jesus first heals a paralyzed man on the Sabbath, which starts a controversy with the Jewish leaders about working on the day of rest. And Jesus says it's his Father who's working on the Sabbath, and so is he. And they catch his meaning, that he was calling God his Father, making himself equal with God, and so they want to kill him. The next story takes place during Passover, the feast that retold the Exodus story with the symbolic meal of the lamb and bread and wine. And Jesus miraculously provides food for a crowd of thousands, which results in people asking him for more bread. And then Jesus goes on to claim that he is the true bread, and if they eat him, they will discover eternal life. And this offends many people who stop following him. After this is a block of stories set in Jerusalem during the Feast of Tabernacles, which retold the story of Israel's wilderness wanderings as God guided them with the pillar of cloud and fire and provided them water in the desert. And Jesus gets up in the temple courts and he shouts, "If anyone is thirsty, let them come to me and drink." And then later he says, "I am the light of the world." He's claiming to be the illuminating presence of God and the life-saving gift of God to his people. And some people believe and follow him, but others are offended and still others try to kill him for these exalted claims.
You see the different responses of the people at the end. Some believe, many oppose. Now we saw that in the last talk. And today we hear Jesus explaining during this Feast of Booths another perspective on why some believe and others oppose him. So let's hear this passage from John chapter 7.
John's Gospel, chapter 7, verses 14 to 24. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" So Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me?" The crowd answered, "You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you?" Jesus answered them, "I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken? Are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment.
Jesus taught with authority. But whose authority? A rabbi would not presume to give his own teaching on his own authority, but quote other rabbis' deliberations that he would have spent a lifetime studying and comparing, and he would have said, Rabbi so-and-so says this, Rabbi such and such says that. But Jesus hasn't studied like that, and yet he is educated in the Spirit, in the Scriptures, and gives a definitive teaching about their meaning. So where has his insight come from? Now, Jesus says his teaching has come from the one who sent him. It's not something which he has thought up for himself. And he gives 3 reasons why you can come to know that. The first reason is Jesus says your response to him depends on whether in the secret core of your being you desire God, desire to do his will. Such a person will know, he says, whether I am speaking from God or just from myself. And it is that inner desire that splits people into those 2 camps, the disciples and the opposers. This is the flip side of what was said to those people offended by his I am the bread of life saying, where he said, no one can come to me unless the Father draws him. And that spoke of the necessity of God changing the hearts and minds of people. But in this passage, he speaks of the characteristic of those who would know the truth, a genuine desire to be true to God. And those who have no such desire will not want to be drawn by the Father. They will not want to be changed. They will not love the Son. Now, those words should be an encouragement to anybody who is not sure of what John is saying. If your desire is to know God, even if you're unsure as whether it exists at the moment, if your desire is to know God and then do his will, then you can be sure that God himself will teach you and lead you, and you will find yourself strangely drawn by this God, and you will find yourself drawn to this Jesus. So take heart, keep listening. It's an encouragement too to those who have been a Christian some years, who have been carried along with the excitement and the joy of being a Christian, but are beginning to wonder whether they can really keep up that faithfulness to the end. That understanding, that faithfulness has come from God. And as we'll see later in John, he will continue to keep you to the end. It is a great reassurance. No, it does not rest with you, but rest with the one who called you. It's also an encouragement in evangelism. It does not come down to our ability to persuade people, to convince people of a particular argument. This is God's work, and God works in response to the hearts of the people who are seeking or not seeking him. And in fact, the reason why Jesus gave that expression, no one comes to me unless the Father draw him, that was to encourage his disciples who saw thousands of people turn from Jesus. And he assured them that all of his own would come to him. So that's the first point. Are you genuine in your desire to seek God? Then you will know about Jesus' teaching. The second point is that you can discern a true teacher from a false one by whose honour he seeks. Does he want to be honoured himself? Then he will be speaking on his own authority and be unreliable because all he wants is praise and recognition. And his message will be tailored to that end. And for that reason, it will be unreliable. But the one who is a faithful emissary seeks the honour of the one who sent him. And he will be reliable. He won't deceive. Now, Jesus has shown great skill in losing disciples because he is faithful to his Father's mission. At the expense of his own popularity, he has lost many disciples. Many TV preachers today would fail that test of honesty and faithfulness to the one who sent them. And Jesus' final point is that your basis for condemning me is flawed. You have the law of Moses, but that very law condemns you. None of you keep it. How can you sit in judgment? You see, it is possible to have a zeal for God, but neither know God nor have any genuine love for him and his desires. And Jesus' opponents were zealous for the law of Moses, and yet they closed their ears to the one that law had promised. Instead, they were filled with hatred and jealousy, a hatred that only Jesus' death would satisfy. You shall not murder. You shall not covet. You shall love the Lord your God. Not one of you keep the law. And their response is that Jesus is mistaken because he has a demon. He is a servant of the devil. But the leaders do want to destroy Jesus. And they wanted to destroy him over that healing of the lame man on the Sabbath. Now, at that time, you might remember that Jesus' defense was that he is his Father's son. And the Father works on the Sabbath, and so I do his work on the Sabbath. But now Jesus is saying that healing of a man by anyone cannot be a breach of the law of Moses. And he says to his opponents, you don't condemn yourselves for circumcising on the Sabbath. On the contrary, you see yourselves as upholding the law. Now, circumcision was a mark of the promises given to Abraham. It predated Moses. And the mark of circumcision showed that the child was an heir of that promise. He was a child of Abraham. And it was to be done on the 8th day, regardless of the day of the week that happened to be. Now, later prophets pointed out that circumcision should represent the circumcision of the heart, the decisive cutting away of evil. And it therefore pointed forward to a change in the person that the law was powerless to do, but that the gospel would do. Now, circumcision predated Moses' giving of the Ten Commandments and had priority over them. 1 in 7 circumcisions would be done on the weekly Sabbath. Now, says Jesus, circumcision deals with a small part of the body to bring that person under the covenant of promise. How much more is it appropriate to make the whole body well? The Sabbath rest from toil. What an appropriate day to give someone rest from physical affliction. Judge Jesus rightly, not on a surface reading of the law, but with understanding. John tells us these things that we might rightly trust in Jesus, and gives us many examples of unbelief and the various motives behind that. Do we have the right judgment? That is given by God to those who genuinely want to know and obey the truth. And how God does that comes a little later in this feast.